February 12th, 1878. A desolate stretch of ice-choked coastline on King William Island. The sun is a pale, indifferent disk hanging just above the horizon, offering no warmth, only a flat, gray light that leaches the world of color. Before you, Lieutenant Alistair Finch of the Royal Navy stands rigid, a ramrod-straight figure of British resolve against the crushing emptiness of the Arctic. The cold is a physical entity here. It is not mere temperature. It is a pressure, a weight. At 47 degrees below zero, the moisture in your breath freezes instantly, clinging to the rough wool of your balaclava, forming a cage of ice around your mouth. Every exhalation is a plume of white vapor, snatched away by a wind that carries the scent of ancient ice and profound loneliness. Finch adjusts his snow goggles, the metal frame a searing shock of cold against the bridge of his nose, even through his gloves. He is observing. His men, a dozen of them, bundled in the finest Navy-issue furs and woolens, are making final checks on their equipment, and what magnificent equipment it is. Their pride and hope are lashed to 3 enormous sledges, each a testament to the industrial might of the British Empire. The frames are of seasoned ash and hickory, scientifically selected for strength and lightness. The cargo, tins of pemmican, sacks of biscuit, scientific instruments, rifles, and ammunition, are meticulously balanced and secured. But the true marvel, the feature Finch prides himself on most, are the runners. They are not wood. They are runners of polished Sheffield steel, a full half-inch thick, designed to glide over the ice with minimal friction, to cut a path through this wilderness with the same unyielding certainty as the Royal Navy's ironclad warships rule the seas. They gleam with a dull, menacing light, a stark, black line of industrial perfection against the endless white. A short distance away, a second group is preparing. They are the Inuit, the locals Finch has hired as guides and dog handlers. Their leader, a man named Uta, works with an economy of motion that seems almost lazy until you realize not a single movement is wasted. He is a man carved from the landscape itself, broad, powerful, his face a mask of weathered leather, creased by years of squinting into the glare of the sun on snow. His eyes, dark and intelligent, miss nothing. He is checking his own team's sledge, the Kumatik, and it is this sledge that draws Finch's critical gaze. To the lieutenant's eyes, it is a shockingly primitive affair. The runners are not steel, but long, curved pieces of bone, yellowed with age, scarred with countless imperfections. Finch had inspected them earlier, tapping one with a gloved knuckle. Whalebone, Uta had communicated through a series of gestures and a few words of broken English. The jawbone of a great bowhead. The crossbars were not neatly mortised planks of ash, but gnarled pieces of driftwood and what looked like caribou antler, lashed to the runners not with screws or bolts, but with intricate bindings of dark, stiff-looking cord. Seal hide, Finch presumed. Rawhide. He had voiced his concerns to his second-in-command, Petty Officer Davies, just that morning. "It's a fragile thing, Davies," he murmured, watching Uta tighten the lashing with a tool made from a sharpened piece of antler. "Ingenious, I suppose, for a people with no access to our foundries. But bone will grow brittle in this cold. It'll crack under the load. We'll be lucky if it lasts a fortnight." Davies, a stout man whose face was already chapped raw by the wind, had nodded in agreement. "Aye, sir. Nothing like good British steel to see a job through, solid as the Isles themselves." Now, watching Uta, Finch feels a renewed surge of confidence in his own methods, his own technology. Uta finishes his work and walks over to his dogs. They are not the well-groomed Newfoundlands that pull one of the British sledges. They are a feral-looking pack of muscle and fur, with curled tails and an unnervingly wolf-like intelligence in their eyes. They do not wait for commands with quiet discipline. They snarl and snap, a barely contained explosion of energy. Uta moves among them without fear, speaking in low, guttural tones, his hand correcting, calming, asserting his dominance. The plan is simple, ambitious, and, in Finch's mind, entirely achievable. They are to push inland, charting the unexplored interior of the island, a final piece in the great puzzle of the Northwest Passage. The Admiralty wants maps. Science wants geological samples and meteorological data. Britain wants its flag planted where no flag has flown before. The steel runners are the key. They will allow the expedition to carry more supplies, to travel faster and farther than any before them. They are the cutting edge of polar exploration. "Mr. Davies," Finch's voice is sharp, cutting through the wind. "Are we ready to proceed?" "All secure, Lieutenant," Davies bellows back, his breath a great cloud. "Teams are harnessed and ready on your mark." Finch gives a curt nod. He pulls his own goggles down, glances once more at Uta's team, then turns his back on them. He places his hand on the guide rail of the lead sledge, the Invincible. The cold of the hickory wood bites through his thick mitten. He can feel the immense static weight of it, over 1,200 pounds of supplies. A dead weight, but once in motion, on those runners, it will fly. "Forward," he commands. "Make way." The drivers crack their whips. The dogs, a mix of St. Bernards and Newfoundlands bred for size and strength, strain in their harnesses. The men put their shoulders to the back of the sledges, their boots digging into the crystalline snow for purchase. For a moment, nothing happens. The sledges are frozen to the spot. Then, with a great groaning screech of metal on ice, the Invincible lurches forward. The other two British sledges follow, the steel runners leaving 3 sets of parallel tracks, clean and precise in the snow. They move slowly at first, but gather momentum, the runners beginning to sing their high, thin song against the ice. Finch allows himself a small, tight smile. This is the sound of progress, the sound of civilization imposing its will on the wilderness. He looks back. Uta's team is now also in motion. But there is a profound difference. Uta gives a single sharp cry, "Wheat! Wheat!" and his dogs leap forward as one. There is no groaning, no initial struggle. The bone runners do not screech. They release from the snow with a soft shh. And the kumatik seems to float forward, its movements fluid, almost alive. It does not plow a rigid furrow in the snow, but seems to flow over it. The entire structure, runners, crossbars, lashings, visibly flexes, conforming to the minute imperfections of the surface. As it passes over a small drift, one runner rises higher than the other, the whole sledge twisting like an animal's spine before settling back into formation. It looks unstable, chaotic, fragile. Finch watches for a moment, a flicker of academic curiosity in his eyes. He notes the way Uta runs alongside, his hand resting lightly on the uprights, steering with subtle shifts of his weight. The Inuit guide isn't fighting the terrain. He seems to be dancing with it. It is, Finch concludes, a clever adaptation born of necessity. But it is the past. His gaze returns to the straight, unwavering lines cut by his own steel runners stretching out before him. That is the future, unbending, uncompromising, superior. The wind howls, a mournful, ancient sound, but Finch does not hear its warning. In his mind, there is only the clean, sharp, triumphant song of steel. The first day's travel is grueling, but they make good time, covering nearly 15 miles before the sun vanishes completely, plunging the world into the deep, star-dusted twilight of the Arctic afternoon. They make camp, the rhythmic work of setting up the heavy canvas tents and lighting the Primus stoves, a familiar comfort in the alien landscape. As the men eat their rations of hot stew and hardtack, the steel runners of the sledges tick and ping in the intense cold, contracting, settling. It sounds like the ticking of a clock, counting down. But to what? No one yet knows. The second week of the expedition begins under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The temperature has fallen further, holding steady at a merciless 52 degrees below zero. At this temperature, the very nature of the world changes. Steel becomes as fragile as porcelain. Rubber becomes as hard as stone. A man's spit freezes before it hits the ground, shattering with a faint tinkle. The air is so cold and dry it feels sharp in the lungs, a sensation like inhaling microscopic shards of glass. Lieutenant Finch drives his men and himself with relentless determination. The daily routine is a brutal cycle of forced energy. Wake in the frozen dark, choke down a breakfast of oatmeal and lukewarm tea, break camp with fingers that have lost all feeling, and then begin the long, soul-crushing haul across the endless plains of wind-blasted snow known as sastrugi. The surface is no longer flat. It is a frozen ocean of ridges and troughs sculpted by the ceaseless wind into waves of concrete-hard snow, some as high as a man's knee. And it is here that the song of the steel runners begins to change. The clean, high-pitched hum of their glide is now punctuated by a jarring chorus of shocks and impacts. Each time the lead sledge, the Invincible, crests a sastrugi ridge, its front dips violently into the trough beyond. The rigid steel runners, unable to flex, slam into the next ridge with a deafening crack that shudders through the entire frame. The 1,200 pounds of cargo, a dead, unyielding weight, magnifies every impact, sending a bone-jarring vibration up the arms of the men heaving at the guide rails. Finch grits his teeth against the constant punishment. He watches Utah's team, which now often travels parallel to them, 100 yards to the port side. The Inuit sledge, the kamutik, moves in a way that is utterly foreign to Finch's understanding of mechanics. When it encounters the sastrugi, it doesn't fight them, it yields. The flexible whalebone runners curve up and over the crests. The hide lashings, which Finch had dismissed as primitive, allow the entire structure to twist and articulate. One runner can be climbing a ridge while the other is deep in a trough, the sled conforming to the terrain like a living creature. The dogs, low-slung and powerful, pick their own way through the maze, responding to Utah's short, sharp calls. The kamutik and its team are not conquering the landscape, they are part of its flow. Meanwhile, the British sledges are waging a war, and they are losing. The first casualty occurs on the 10th day. They are navigating a particularly rough patch of ice, a field of pressure ridges where the sea ice has buckled under its own immense weight, creating a chaotic jumble of jagged blue blocks. Petty Officer Davies is steering the third sledge, the Resolution, which carries the bulk of their scientific equipment. He tries to guide it through a narrow gap. The front of the right runner strikes a hidden block of ice, submerged just beneath a layer of fresh snow. The sound is not loud. It is a sharp, sickening tink, like a fine crystal glass being struck with a spoon. It is a sound that does not belong in this world of muffled whites and howling winds. The sledge lurches to a halt. Davies curses, thinking he's merely stuck. "Heave, lads, put your backs into it," he roars at the two men behind him. They push. The sledge grinds forward a few inches, accompanied by a horrible scraping noise. Finch, seeing the delay, halts the column and walks back. "What's the trouble, Mr. Davies?" "Just snagged on a bit of ice, sir. Nothing to worry." Davies' voice trails off as he stoops to examine the runner. He lets out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." Finch pushes past him and kneels in the snow. There, on the gleaming surface of the Sheffield steel, there is a hairline fracture, a clean, crescent-shaped crack running a third of the way through the half-inch plate. It looks impossibly delicate,
a flaw in a piece of fine china, but its implications are monstrous. "It's the cold, sir," Davies says, his voice hushed. "Makes the steel brittle, like glass." Finch stares at the crack. His mind, trained in the precise and predictable world of naval engineering, struggles to process the information. Steel was strength. Steel was reliability. It was the backbone of the empire. For it to fail here in this wasteland felt like a personal betrayal. He remembers his own words to Davies, "Nothing like good British steel." The memory is a bitter pill. Uta and his team have stopped nearby. The Inuit guide walks over, his mukluks making no sound on the snow. He crouches down, his expression unreadable, and examines the fracture. He runs a bare, calloused finger over the sharp edge of the crack, then looks up at Finch. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. His silence is more damning than any words of reproach. He simply observes the failure of their foreign, vaunted technology, his gaze communicating a deep, ancient, and patient understanding of this place that makes Finch feel like a trespasser. "We can manage," Finch says, his voice tight with forced authority. He stands up, brushing the snow from his knees. "We'll redistribute the weight. Take some of the instruments from this sledge and move them to the Dauntless. We'll favor the left runner on the Resolution. We press on." The repair is a clumsy, desperate affair. They have no way to weld the steel. Their only option is to try to reinforce it. Using a hand drill, a tool that takes immense effort to turn in the freezing cold, the metal of the bit groaning in protest, they manage to bore 2 holes on either side of the crack. Then lash a spare hickory plank across the top of the runner, cinching it down with ropes that are stiff as iron wire. It is a crude fix, a splint on a compound fracture. It adds weight and creates drag. The journey resumes, but the rhythm is broken. The pace slows to a crawl. The men handling the Resolution have to constantly maneuver it with agonizing care, trying to protect its wounded side. The damaged runner no longer glides, it scrapes and judders, leaving a gouged, ugly scar in the snow. The psychological blow is even more severe than the physical one. Doubt, like the cold, begins to seep into the men. They look at the sledges not with pride, but with a new, wary apprehension. They listen to the sounds they make, flinching at every loud report of steel on ice, imagining new fractures, new failures. Finch pushes them harder, as if his own willpower can somehow hold the metal together. He is quieter now, his commands clipped and sharp. He spends less time observing the landscape and more time staring at the runners of his own sledge, the Invincible, searching their polished surfaces for the first sign of a fatal flaw. He feels the cold not just on his skin, but deep in his bones, a chilling premonition of a disaster forged in the foundries of home and delivered here at the frozen end of the world. The song of the steel has become a dirge, and every man in the expedition can hear it.
The end comes on the 15th day, in the heart of a vast, featureless plain of ice. There is no dramatic pressure ridge, no hidden obstacle. The failure is born of simple, cumulative fatigue, a relentless, microscopic weakening that has been building with every jarring impact on the sastrugi, every vibration, every tick and ping of the metal contracting in the abyssal cold. The temperature has dropped again during the night, a new floor of 60 degrees below zero. At this temperature, the very air seems to have given up. It is still, silent, and carries a sense of profound and final emptiness. Lieutenant Finch is at the front, leaning into his harness alongside the dogs, his body a machine of grim forward motion. The sky is a high, clear, unforgiving blue. The sun, a distant spark, casts long, distorted shadows that make the sastrugi ridges look like the exposed ribs of some colossal skeleton. The Invincible is immediately behind him, its 1,200 pounds of life-sustaining cargo a monstrous burden.
He can feel the sledge's every lurch and shudder through the tow rope biting into his shoulder. The scraping sound from the Resolution's patched runner is a constant, grating reminder of their vulnerability. They are crossing a section of the plain that is unusually hard, the snow packed by the wind into a surface like rippled concrete. The sledge rises over a low, broad ridge, no different than the thousands they have already crossed. As the front of the runners crests the peak, the weight of the sledge shifts. The full 1,200 pounds, for a fraction of a second, is concentrated on the middle of the steel runners as they bridge the gap between the crest and the next point of contact in the trough. The sound is not a tink this time. It is an explosion. A deafening bang like a rifle shot echoes across the silent plains, sharp and shockingly violent. It is followed instantly by a sound of catastrophic disintegration, a crystalline, shattering noise like a giant pane of glass being dropped onto a stone floor. The Invincible collapses. It doesn't just stop, it implodes. The front of the sledge digs into the snow as if it has been struck by a cannonball. The momentum of the rear half, still moving forward, drives it into the wreckage, splintering the hickory frame. Sacks of flour and biscuit burst open, a cloud of white powder mingling with the snow. Tins of pemmican and crates of scientific instruments are thrown clear, scattering across the ice in a chaotic yard sale of failure. The men cry out in shock and alarm. The dogs, startled by the noise, begin to howl and bark, their lines tangling in a panicked frenzy. Finch is thrown from his feet by the sudden stop. He lands hard, the air knocked from his lungs. For a moment he lies there, stunned, the impossible sound still ringing in his ears. He pushes himself up, his mind refusing to accept what his senses are telling him. He looks back at the Invincible, or what's left of it. It is a complete and utter wreck. The sledge has broken its back, but the cause of the disaster is what freezes the blood in his veins. The runners, the magnificent Sheffield steel runners, are gone. In their place are jagged stumps of twisted metal. The rest of the runners lie in pieces on the snow, dozens of sharp, angular shards of steel glittering malevolently in the pale sunlight. They didn't bend, they didn't crack, they detonated. The extreme cold had altered the molecular structure of the steel, transforming it from a ductile metal into a substance with the tensile strength of cheap glass. Cold brittleness, a textbook phenomenon he had read about in engineering manuals, was no longer an academic concept. It was here, tangible and ruinous. Petty Officer Davies is the first to reach the wreck. He stands over it, his hands on his hips, his face a mask of disbelief. "Sweet Mother of God," he whispers, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He nudges a shard of the runner with the toe of his boot. It is about a foot long, with a fracture surface that sparkles like quartz. It just came apart. The other men gather around, their faces pale with shock. The silence that follows is heavier and more terrifying than the explosion itself. In that silence, every man is doing the same grim calculation. They are more than 100 miles from the coast, from the relative safety of the ship. The Invincible carried the bulk of their food, their shelter, and their fuel. The Resolution is already crippled. The Dauntless, the last remaining sledge, cannot possibly carry the men and the essential gear. They are stranded. The word hangs unspoken in the air, as sharp and cold as the steel fragments at their feet. Finch walks through the debris, his mind a maelstrom of fury and despair. He sees the spilled bags of biscuit, already being colonized by the wind. He sees a shattered crate of geological samples, the product of weeks of hard labor, now just a pile of useless rocks. He sees his own reflection, distorted and broken, in a piece of the shattered runner. The face staring back at him is that of a fool, a proud, arrogant fool who had bet their lives on a theory of superiority,
on the flawed gospel of steel. And then he hears it, a soft, rhythmic shoo-shoo-shoo-shoo-shoo. He looks up. Uta has brought his team to a halt at a respectful distance away. He stands beside his kamutik, his dogs sitting quietly in their harnesses, watching the scene with an air of calm patience. The whalebone runners of his sledge are pristine. They rest on the snow, their curved, organic forms looking supple and strong. They have traveled over exactly the same terrain, endured the exact same temperatures, yet here they stand whole and hale, while the pride of British industry lies in glittering ruins. Uta's gaze meets Finch's across the field of wreckage. There is no triumph in his eyes, no hint of "I told you so." There is only a quiet, profound solemnity. He understands the totality of the disaster. He knows, better than any of the Englishmen, precisely how desperate their situation has become. The sun begins its slow descent, and the temperature plummets with it. The shadows lengthen, turning from gray to a deep, menacing purple. The wind begins to pick up, a low moan that promises a night of unimaginable cold. The men huddled together, their earlier bravado gone, replaced by a primal, creeping fear. They are small, fragile things in this immense, indifferent landscape. Their technology, their lifeline to the world they knew, has shattered. And as darkness closes in, Alistair Finch finally understands. He is not a commander anymore. He is a supplicant. His survival, and the survival of his men, now rests entirely in the hands of the man with the sledge made of bone.
The hours that followed the shattering of the Invincible were a slow descent into a frozen hell. Despair was a palpable presence in the camp, as thick and suffocating as the canvas of their tents. The men worked in a stunned, mechanical silence, salvaging what they could from the wreckage under Finch's clipped, hollow-sounding orders. They gathered the scattered tins and the pathetic, snow-dusted remnants of their flour and biscuit. They righted the broken frame of the sledge, a useless skeleton that served only as a monument to their failure. The jagged shards of the steel runners were gathered into a pile, a small cairn of industrial hubris. They were too sharp, too dangerous to be left scattered. As the last of the light bled from the sky, replaced by the ethereal, shifting curtains of the aurora borealis, the true gravity of their predicament settled in. The wind rose to a gale, tearing at the tents, and the temperature continued its relentless fall. Inside, huddled around the sputtering blue flame of a single Primus stove, the men were shadows, their faces etched with fear. They were 100 miles from the ship, with a single, overburdened sledge, the Dauntless, and another that was crippled. They could not go forward, and retreat seemed impossible. Finch sat apart, a tin cup of tepid tea growing cold in his hands. The weight of command was a physical pressure on his shoulders, crushing him. He replayed the expedition in his mind, every decision, every confident assertion. He saw his own dismissive glance at Uta's kamutik, heard his own proud pronouncements to Davies about the superiority of steel. The shame was a hot, corrosive acid in his gut. He had led these men to this. His certainty, his faith in the unbending logic of British engineering had stranded them on the edge of oblivion. Through a small opening in the tent flap, he could see the Inuit camp. It was not a camp in the English sense. Uta and the 2 other hunters with him, a young man named Aklak and an elder called Tagurnak, had not bothered with canvas. Instead, they had unsheathed their long snow knives and in less than 2 hours of methodical work had constructed a snow house, an igloo. Its domed shape was elegant, perfect, and utterly impervious to the gale that was now threatening to rip the seams of Finch's own tent.
A warm yellow light emanated from within, a beacon of impossible comfort and security in the raging blizzard. They were not merely surviving the storm, they were at home in it. The realization was as sharp and clear as the shattering of the steel. Finch was not Utah's employer. He was not the ranking officer. Here, in this world, he was a child, ignorant and helpless. All his training, all his knowledge of navigation and naval discipline was worthless. The skills that mattered here were the ones he had dismissed as primitive: the ability to read the snow, to speak the language of the dogs, to build shelter from the very storm that sought to kill you. He had to act. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered. Pulling his furs tight around him, he pushed his way out of the tent. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving ice crystals into his exposed skin. He staggered through the blinding, swirling snow toward the faint glow of the igloo. The entrance was a low tunnel, and he had to get down on his hands and knees to crawl through it, a posture of supplication that was not lost on him. He emerged into a space that was impossibly, miraculously warm. A single seal oil lamp, the kulik, cast a soft, smoky light, its flame dancing. The air was thick with the smells of warm fur, cooking meat, and human occupation. Utah, Aklak, and Tagranak were sitting on a raised platform of snow covered with caribou skins. They were eating, using their crescent-shaped ulu knives to cut slices from a piece of frozen char. They stopped and looked up as Finch entered, their faces calm and impassive. There was no surprise, no judgment. It was as if they had been expecting him. Finch remained on his knees at the entrance, the melting snow from his clothes pooling around him. The words caught in his throat. How could he articulate the totality of his failure? How could he ask for help from a man whose wisdom he had so thoroughly disdained? Utah gestured with his knife toward a space on the snow platform, an invitation. Finch crawled forward and sat, feeling clumsy and oversized in the small space. For a long moment no one spoke. The only sounds were the hiss of the kulik and the muffled howl of the wind outside. Finally, Finch looked at Utah. He did not try to use the broken English they had communicated in before. He spoke with his hands, with his eyes, with the sheer, unvarnished desperation in his posture. He pointed back in the direction of his own camp, then made a sharp braking motion with his hands. He tapped his chest, then held up his hands, palms open, an admission of emptiness, of helplessness. Then he looked at Utah, his gaze a direct, unashamed plea for aid. Utah listened, his head tilted slightly. He understood everything. He understood the broken sledge, the failed metal, the stranded men, the terror. He also understood the crushing weight of the lieutenant's broken pride. He put down his knife and his piece of fish. He turned to the elder, Tagernak, and they spoke for a few moments in the soft, guttural clicks and tones of Inuktitut. The old man nodded slowly, his ancient, wrinkled eyes fixed on Finch. Then Utah turned back to the lieutenant. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the edge of the lamp's stone base. On a flattened piece of snow on the floor, he began to draw. First, he drew two long, parallel lines, the runners. He pointed to them, then looked at Finch and shook his head slowly. He then drew the British sledge, a rigid, boxy rectangle. He made a striking motion with his hand and then drew the sledge again, this time in broken pieces. His message was clear. Your design is wrong. It is too stiff. It fights the land, and the land always wins. Then he began a new drawing. Again, he drew the two long parallel lines.
But this time he did not connect them with rigid crossbars. He drew a series of shorter lines between them, and at each intersection he drew a small circle, tapping it with his finger. Then he made a twisting, flexing motion with his hands. He was explaining the lashings, the genius of the articulated joint that allowed the camutic to move with the terrain. He looked up at Finch, then pointed out of the igloo into the storm, and then swept his arm in a wide arc. He was indicating the land itself, the vast, empty, resource-poor land. He picked up a piece of antler that lay nearby and pointed to his own sledge runner, the whalebone. He was showing Finch that the solutions were not to be found in a factory thousands of miles away. They were here, provided by the land, by the animals that lived upon it. The materials for survival were all around them, if only one had the eyes to see and the knowledge to use them. Finch watched, mesmerized. This was not a simple offer of help. It was a lesson, a profound, humbling education in the philosophy of the Arctic. It was a lesson in humility, in adaptation, in seeing the world not as an obstacle to be conquered, but as a living entity to be understood and respected. Finch finished his drawing. He looked at Finch, a question in his eyes. Finch understood. Utah was asking if he was ready to learn, if he was ready to abandon his own failed knowledge and embrace a wisdom that was thousands of years old. Slowly, deliberately, Alistair Finch, Lieutenant of the Royal Navy, servant of the British Empire, gave a single, deep nod. Yes, he was ready. In the warm, quiet sanctuary of the igloo, as the storm raged outside, the balance of power had irrevocably.
The blizzard raged for 2 more days, a white curtain that sealed them off from the world. For the British sailors, it was a period of confinement and gnawing anxiety, huddled in their freezing tents, rationing their dwindling fuel. But for Finch, it was a time of intense and transformative education. He spent most of his waking hours in the igloo, a silent apprentice in a classroom of snow and skin. The lessons were not delivered in lectures, but in actions, in the patient, methodical work of Utah and his companions as they prepared for the monumental task ahead, building a new sledge from the wreckage of the old world and the materials of theirs. The first lesson was in seeing. Utah would take Finch to the entrance of the igloo and point out into the swirling maelstrom. At first, Finch saw nothing but a chaotic, undifferentiated wall of white. But Utah would point to subtle shifts in the texture of the blowing snow, the way it drifted around the igloo, the pitch and timbre of the wind's howl. He was teaching Finch to read the storm, to understand its language, to know when it was weakening, when it would be safe to work. This was knowledge that could not be found in any admiralty chart or meteorological textbook. It was a living knowledge, passed down through uncounted generations. When the storm finally broke, leaving behind a world scoured clean and silent under a painfully bright sun, the work began in earnest. Their goal was to build one large new camutic, capable of carrying the essential food and gear from the Invincible and the Resolution, which would be abandoned. The frame of the Dauntless was salvaged, its steel runners discarded without ceremony, but the primary materials would have to come from the land. Finch assumed this would mean a long, arduous search. He was wrong. Utah knew where to look. He led Finch and Davies not on a hunt, but on a walk along a series of low, wind-swept ridges a few miles from the camp. Finch had seen only rock and snow. Utah saw a storehouse. Protruding from a snowdrift was the enormous curved bone he had been looking for. It was the jawbone of a bowhead whale,
carried far inland by some geological upheaval or ancient tide, and left here waiting. It was immense, nearly 15 feet long, thicker than a man's thigh, and possessed a graceful sweeping curve that was perfect for a runner. It had likely been lying here for centuries, a landmark known only to the Inuit. To Finch, it was a miracle. To Uta, it was simply an entry in his vast mental map of this land. They spent the next day freeing the massive bone from the frozen earth, using the broken shards of the steel runners as crude spades and pry bars, the first of many ironies. Getting it back to camp was an epic struggle. But as they worked, Finch observed the genius of Inuit tools. Aklak used an adze with a head of sharpened slate to chip away at the frozen ground, its wooden handle short and perfectly balanced for powerful, controlled strokes. Tagurnak, the elder, directed the work, his quiet voice indicating the precise point to apply leverage, his experience preventing the bone from fracturing during the extraction. Back at camp, the real craftsmanship began. The single jawbone had to be split lengthwise to create 2 runners. This was a task Finch would have assumed required a large industrial saw. Uta's method was elegantly simple. Using the sharp edge of a steel shard, he and Aklak painstakingly scribed a deep groove down the entire length of the bone. Then, using small antler wedges, they began to tap, tap, tap along the groove. It was a process of patience, of listening to the bone, of feeling the vibrations. After hours of this gentle, persistent persuasion, the massive bone split apart with a deep thump, separating into 2 perfectly matched halves. The next phase was shaping the runners. The crossbars, or napu, would not be bolted on. They would rest on top. To hold them, dozens of holes had to be drilled through the dense, thick bone of the runners. The British expedition had a hand-cranked drill, but Uta showed him his own. It was a bow drill, a simple but ingenious device. A sharpened flint or metal point was set in a wooden shaft. A bow, strung with a leather thong, was wrapped around the shaft. By sawing the bow back and forth, Uta could spin the drill bit at an incredible speed, the friction creating a thin spiral of bone dust. Finch watched, amazed, as the Inuit hunters drilled hole after hole with a speed and precision his own clumsy freezing metal tool could never match. While the runners were being prepared, Davies and his men were tasked with dismantling the hickory frames of the Invincible and the Dauntless, salvaging the best crossbars. But the most critical element was still missing, the lashings. Finch had assumed they would use rope. Uta shook his head. Rope was too stiff. It had no life. It would abrade and break. The solution came from Aklak, who had been successful in a hunt. He returned to camp dragging a large, bearded seal. Within hours, the animal had been transformed. The meat and blubber were set aside for food and fuel. But the hide was treated with special reverence. It was scraped clean of fat and hair, and then cut, not in straight lines, but in a continuous spiral, like peeling an apple. This technique produced a single, immensely long and incredibly strong line of rawhide from a single hide. This was ukiuhak, the seal hide rope that was the secret to the Kamutik's strength. The lines were then stretched and left to freeze solid. The assembly of the new sledge was a revelation to Finch. He watched as Uta laid the 2 massive bone runners parallel on the snow. The salvaged hickory crossbars were placed across them. Then, using the frozen, stiff-as-wire seal hide lines, Uta and Tagurnak began to lash the sledge together. It was a form of complex knot-tying that was both an engineering science and an art form. The line was threaded through the holes in the runners, wrapped around the crossbars in a specific, intricate pattern, and pulled taut with a tool made from a walrus tusk. The genius was in the tension. The knots were not cinched down to create a rigid, unmoving joint. They were tied in such a way that they allowed for a small, controlled amount of movement. Each of the 20 crossbars was an independent, articulated joint. When Utam was finished, he stood up and placed his foot on one end of the sledge, pushing down. The entire structure twisted, flexing like a living thing. The joints gave, the runners curved, the crossbars shifted slightly, and then it all returned to its original shape when the pressure was released. The sledge wasn't a single solid object. It was a system, a complex skeleton designed to absorb and dissipate shock, not resist it. The whalebone runners provided the smooth, durable gliding surface, flexible enough to bend over obstacles. The hickory crossbars provided the structure, and the seal hide lashings were the ligaments and tendons, the connective tissue that gave the entire creation its life and its incredible resilience. Finch ran his hand over a finished lashing. The hide was hard as iron, but he knew that when it was under stress, it would have a microscopic amount of give that would make all the difference. He looked at the completed sledge. It was a hybrid, a synthesis of two worlds. The runners were ancient whalebone, the crossbars were English hickory, and the lashings were pure Inuit ingenuity. It was not as clean or as polished as the Invincible had been. It looked rugged, almost crude, but Finch now saw it for what it was, a masterpiece of functional design born from millennia of experience. It was not built to conquer the Arctic. It was built to be a part of it.
The journey back to the coast was not a retreat, it was a pilgrimage. The character of the expedition had been fundamentally transformed. The frantic, punishing pace set by Finch was gone, replaced by a steady, rhythmic cadence dictated by Uta, by the dogs, by the land itself. There was no more war against the sastrugi. There was only movement. The new hybrid sledge, which the sailors had christened the Hope, performed beyond Finch's wildest imaginings. It was a colossal thing, nearly 18 feet long, laden with all the salvaged food, fuel, and scientific gear they could carry. It was heavier than the Invincible had been, yet it seemed to move with a fraction of the effort. The broad, polished whalebone runners slid over the snow with a soft, whispery shush, a sound of cooperation, not conflict. When they encountered the jarring, concrete-hard ridges of snow, the sledge no longer slammed into them, it flowed. Finch would watch, still in awe, as the front of the runners curved upward, lifting the load smoothly over the crest. The entire frame would twist and articulate, the dozens of seal-hide lashings tightening and relaxing like muscles, absorbing every shock, distributing the stress throughout the structure. Not once did it threaten to break. Not once did it falter. The men's roles had changed too. They were no longer simply beasts of burden, heaving against an inanimate object. Uta taught them how to run alongside the kamutik, to use their weight to help steer it, to anticipate the terrain, to become part of the dynamic system of sledge, dogs, and driver. Petty Officer Davies, a man who had only ever known the rigid mechanics of naval machinery, found he had a natural talent for it. Learning Uta's whistled commands to the dogs, his face for the first time split by a broad grin as they crested a particularly rough patch of ice without so much as a jolt. The fear that had haunted the camp was replaced by a quiet, hard-won competence. They were learning to survive, not with the tools of their world, but with the wisdom of this one. Finch became Uta's shadow. He no longer saw a primitive guide. He saw a scientist of the highest order, whose laboratory was the ice, whose experiments had been refined over 1,000 years. He learned how to navigate not just by compass and sextant, but by the direction of the wind-carved sastrugi, by the color of the ice, by the flight of a lone snow bunting. He learned that the Inuit did not view the cold as an enemy to be defeated with sheer force, but as a fundamental condition to be understood and adapted to. Their clothing of caribou skin, with its hollow hairs, was infinitely warmer and more breathable than the finest British wool, which held sweat and then froze. Their diet of raw meat and fat provided the exact nutrients and calories needed for survival, something their own tinned rations could never match. One evening as they made camp, Finch stood beside the Hope, running his bare hand, now calloused and accustomed to the cold, over the whalebone runner. It was cool and smooth, feeling less like an object and more like the bone of a living thing. Utah came and stood beside him. Finch gestured from the bone runner to the pile of shattered steel shards they still carried with them. He looked at Utah, and a question in his eyes that went beyond mere mechanics. Why? Why is this so much better? Utah understood. He picked up one of the jagged, glittering pieces of the Sheffield steel. He held it out. It was rigid, unyielding. He made a sharp striking motion with his other hand. Snap! He then placed his hand on the whalebone runner, pressing down. The bone gave, flexing slightly under his weight, then returning to its shape. He looked at Finch and then gestured out at the vast, powerful, and unforgiving landscape around them. His meaning was profound, a philosophical lesson delivered in perfect silence. The land, he communicated, is not rigid. It is always moving, always changing. The wind, the snow, the ice, they are fluid and powerful. To resist them with unbending force is to invite destruction. Steel is strong, but it is proud. It will not bend, so it breaks. Bone is also strong, but it is humble. It knows how to yield, how to flex, how to move with the forces of the world instead of against them. Its resilience comes not from its rigidity, but from its adaptability. In that moment, Alistair Finch understood the unbending lesson. His entire worldview, the bedrock certainty of the British Empire's technological and cultural superiority, was shattered as completely as his steel runners. True mastery was not about imposition, but about integration. True strength was not rigidity, but resilience. When they finally reached the coast and the ship frozen into the ice of the bay, the men who stumbled back were not the same men that had left. They were leaner, harder, and quieter. Their eyes held a new kind of wisdom. Finch spent the long journey home filling his logbook not with heroic tales of conquest, but with meticulous drawings of the Kamutik, detailed notes on the principles of its construction, and heartfelt praise for the genius of its creators. His official report to the Admiralty caused a stir. He advocated that all future polar expeditions abandon the standard-issue naval sledges and adopt designs entirely based on Inuit technology. He was ridiculed by some, dismissed as having gone native. But others listened. Explorers like Peary and Amundsen, the giants who would later reach the poles, did not make the same mistake. Their expedition succeeded where so many others had failed precisely because they embraced Inuit knowledge wholesale. They wore Inuit clothing, ate Inuit food, and traveled on Inuit sledges pulled by Inuit dogs. The humble Kamutik, with its runners of bone and its lashings of sinew, became the gold standard for Arctic travel, its elegant, adaptable design outlasting and outperforming every competitor. The legacy of that failed expedition was not a new map or a planted flag. It was a transfer of knowledge, a humbling admission that in some of the world's harshest corners, the most advanced technology is not forged in the fires of a foundry, but grown from the bone of a whale and the accumulated wisdom of a people who had learned the greatest lesson the Arctic has to teach: bend, or you will break.